And today we're going to talk about irrigation specifically for the vegetable garden, though you can apply these concepts to a lot of other areas of the garden. Really, it's very, very general to most types of gardening. We'll talk about some of the layouts, which might be more specific to vegetable gardens, because I know most people don't grow, say, their landscapes in straight lines like we might do in the vegetable garden. But we're going to sort of start off talking about why we're going to irrigate, and then how much and how we irrigate. And we'll learn all those different things in our time together today. So first off, is irrigation necessary? Well, there are some times of the year when we get a lot of rain. There are some times of the year when we don't get a lot of rain. And so that natural rainfall is usually irregular and at times insufficient for efficient and healthy plant growth. There are times, especially in summer, when it gets very hot and very dry. Plants are using a lot more water when it's hotter, and we'll talk about that a little bit. We're not going to go into heavy detail about that, but there are times when we need a little more water. But on average, we should be aiming to get around 1 inch of water on those plants. So imagine if it rained every week and we didn't have to irrigate, like we were living in some perfect biome, we would be aiming for about 1 inch of precipitation on that soil per week. And so what that would mean would be over all of the surface area of the garden. If it rained and we were able to capture that water, it should be about an inch deep. The water that hits that soil every week. There are times, like I said, when we might need a little bit more during certain stages of maturity or growth of the plant, or when it's very hot and the plants will use more water. But on average, plants need about 1 inch of water on that soil surface and soaking down into the soil per week. So if we don't get that, that's when we have to irrigate. Now, there are other times when we have lots of storms coming through where we get more than we need. And we can't really do anything about that other than hopefully we have good soil and we get good drainage and get that away from the garden. And you'll still see people out there, especially with their irrigation on their lawns, that they have them on timers. And I've driven through Omaha and I have seen timers or irrigation running on lawns while it's raining. And so those are things we want to avoid. And especially in the vegetable garden, we can have a really big impact on health if we overwater as well as if we underwater. So how much water do I really need? So like I said, that rainfall plus irrigation should average about 1 inch per week. So if I were sort of doing the geometry, if I had a 1 square foot section of soil, that 1 square foot I should have, if it were solid and I poured the rain on it or the water on it, there should be an inch of water sitting on top of that before it soaks in. Really, we don't have something sitting out there to catch it unless we have like a rain gauge that can actually give you an idea of how much water you have. And that would be a good idea to have in your garden to see, oh yeah, we got half an inch of rain this week, so I need to add a half an inch of rain to the garden. Or we got an inch and a half of rain this week, I might not need to water the garden. And that can make sure we're approaching watering from both a plant health standpoint, but also an efficiency and environmental standpoint. We don't need to be using water if we have enough already in the garden. We do see that we want deep, heavy waterings, but it might be better to break them up instead of watering once per week, is to water a few times per week so that we have water up on the surface of the soil where a lot of our shallow roots are. And also we can get those deeper waterings so we have deeper water in the soil so that we can have those deeper rooted plants watered, because we have not everything has a shallow root, not everything has a deep root. And so we want to make sure that we keep the water a few times a week to make sure that things are getting the water that we need. Like I said, there might be times when temperatures are very high and the plants actually go through transpiration. That's how they move water from the roots up. They let it out of the pores on their leaves, so they actually lose water through water vapor. And when it's really hot, that goes faster. Plants are also going through what we call respiration much faster when it's hot. So they actually are going through their processes much faster and will use more water. And so when it's really warm, say above 85 degrees, you probably should be watering a little bit more than that 1 inch because they might need more water than that. So how do you know, like if you're using a watering can, or later on we're going to talk about drip irrigation, how much is that 1 inch of water? If you had to measure it out, if you were, using a watering can or something like that. Well, 1 inch of water over that 1 square foot, like I was talking earlier, is zero 0.6 gallons. So it's about 2/3 of a gallon. So if you imagine if you went and bought a gallon of milk, it's about 2/3 of that gallon jug per square foot is what you need for that 1 inch. And so if we're using that measured irrigation, like drip irrigation, and we'll talk about that in a bit, we would calculate the number of gallons we need by figuring out the square footage of the coverage area and how much water comes out of our irrigation. And there are other ways that we can measure that as well. And we'll talk about that toward the end. Like I said, there are times of plant growth where different vegetables need maybe a little more water. And these are what we would call like a critical irrigation period. Almost every one of them is going to need more water when you first plant them because, if you're transplanting, like putting a tomato in the ground or a pepper in the ground, because they don't have really well-established roots. It takes about 2 to 3 weeks for that plant to really get established in the soil and to have enough roots to uptake water. And so we need to make sure we have enough water in the soil for the limited roots to take up water. So we'll need more water if we're planting a plant into the ground. And then usually, I'm not going to go through this whole list, but usually it is whenever if it's a fruiting plant, let's say like a tomato or a pepper or beans, or especially like melons, we think about a watermelon, it actually uses a lot of water to grow that fruit. So during the fruit development, we need a lot of water. So whenever the fruit is setting, whenever the fruit is ripening, though we can, if we get too much, like if we get a heavy rain when those watermelons are almost ripe or the cabbage is almost ready to be harvested, you might have seen this, things can actually take up too much water and they can actually burst open. So you might see like busted watermelons or cabbage heads that split open, or if you see like radishes or turnips that have split, that's usually from uneven watering and it's taken up too much water right when it's getting ready to be mature. And so we do want to take a look at these to know that maybe we need a little more than that 1 inch of water equivalent during the week, during these periods. So I want to talk about 4 major types of irrigation. And I've sort of listed them from the most efficient, or what I consider the most efficient, to the least efficient. And that's both in terms of time, how much time does it take you physically to do the watering, to how accurate they are, how easy is it for you to control where the water goes, and then also how much loss do you have from, say, evaporation, or from the lack of accuracy, where you're putting water where you don't really need it. And so probably the most efficient is drip irrigation. And then we have soaker hoses and sprinklers, and those are sort of like, give or take a little bit. And then hand, where you're out with a water hose watering by hand. And so there are some trade-offs there, but these are sort of like, especially in terms of time, probably this is the most efficient to the least efficient. And we're going to go backwards in order as I talk a little bit about them. So we have that manual or hand watering. We're all used to that. We get out, during the day, whenever it's especially hot and dry, we get out the water hose. We take time to actually water them. So this is good for spot irrigation. Say you have 1 or 2 things that just need water versus like a whole garden. They're more accurate than sprinklers. so you can actually direct the water exactly to the plant where you want it. But some negatives of this often results in water splashing on plants. Whenever we're watering, we have a heavy stream of water coming from overhead, and so it hits the plant or it hits the soil. And if we have the plants wet for a long period of time, like Kyle was saying in his introduction, water sort of lends itself to disease development. And so if we're getting the foliage wet and the foliage is staying wet consistently, that gives more opportunities for fungi and bacteria to develop on the plant. And so when we're watering overhead with a hand or a sprinkler, we're getting the plant wet, and it can actually give us more disease incident. Or if we're aiming for the soil and we're spraying the soil underneath and we're splashing water and soil up on the plant, that can also be adding diseases to the plant. And so just, keeping that in mind is something to consider. If you do use one of these methods that's overhead, like the hand sprayer or the sprinkler, one thing you can do is to water earlier in the day to make sure that the plants have time to dry before we have a long period of sort of cooler temperatures, and also the higher dew points in the evening, so that the water doesn't evaporate as much. So we want that water to evaporate as quickly as possible from the plant. This can be time and labor prohibitive. It can take a while to do this if you have a big garden. And most people actually don't water enough usually with this method. They'll, glaze over the garden and not really taking into consideration that, hey, we need that 1 inch of water, or we need to let it run long enough on that one area for the water to soak down into the soil. And so it can take a long time if you're doing it correctly. And if you are using one of these like manual, the actual like nozzle type things on your hose, you want to use the gentler patterns like a shower or a mist versus like the jet or those high powered things, because that can actually disturb the soil and splash more. So the gentler you can get that pattern, the better. So now we go to sprinklers. So these are the least accurate in terms of putting the water where you want it, because usually they have a big spray pattern, and your garden may or may not fit that exact size or that shape. Also, it's hard to using these to direct water to specific crops. So we know that maybe our tomatoes need more water when they're setting fruit than our lettuce does because it's just starting. And so we can actually not fine tune our sprinkling like we can even like the hand irrigation, but drip irrigation and soaker hoses, we can be a little more specific with our crops. Like I said, that splashing water really increases disease incidence. And we do get a larger loss due to evaporation. The water spraying up in the air. And if it's a really hot day, it can actually evaporate much faster through the air. And so we do lose some more to evaporation this way. However, we can automate this with timers if we want to. So that can make it easier where we don't have to remember to go outside and turn the water on and off. And that can be important because I speak from experience. It wasn't a sprinkler, it was a soaker hose. But I accidentally left mine on once for a few days. And not only was the garden soaked, but I had like a $200 water bill and a $200 sewer bill just for those few days of water that I accidentally put on the garden. So you want to watch out for that. So soaker hoses are one of those things that you can use that's a little more directed. So this is basically a water hose that is permeable. So you see here in this picture that the water actually sort of drops out of the hose. And this can be used as an alternative to, say, the sprinkler in the hand, where we're actually just putting the water right on the soil, so it's not splashing up on the plant. It's not raining down on the plant. We can automate these with timers. Once again, we can use a timer on this so that Once we figure out how much water it lets off, we can figure out how much we need to let it run. And so we can do that. However, with a soaker hose, it's basically lets water out wherever, and it usually comes out at the beginning of the hose at a higher rate than the end of the hose because it's unregulated pressure. So the water takes the least path of resistance, and it comes out basically at the beginning, and you might not get as much water at the end. So therefore, you can have a regular distribution. So your plants at the beginning of the hose will get more water. The plants at the end of the hose will get less water. So it isn't quite as accurate and regular as drip irrigation. So drip irrigation, once again, eliminates that splashing, but it allows us to deliver water to specific plants or areas because we have a tubing or a hose or a tape or an emitter that lets out little drops of water in specific places. It's the most efficient and accurate type of irrigation that you can use. And one of the nice things is that it has irrigated or regulated pressure, which means that there's going to be a pressure regulator that you put on before it gets into the system. But then each of those spots or drops or wherever the water comes out actually is controlled so that it only lets out so much water per usually hour is how it's measured. And so it actually, at a certain number or level of pressure, that's how much water will come out of there. And so if you buy a kit, usually you buy a drip irrigation kit, it will have the correct, there's a pressure regulator that goes on the hose to say, we need 30 PSI, which is pounds per square inch of pressure. And so it will make the water 30 PSI, which usually our water coming out of our outdoor faucets are much higher pressure than that. And it regulates that pressure so that we get the same drips throughout the entire system as long as it's not too long. There's not like, you can't make this, 1,000 feet long usually. So we get those specific drips and we can control it much better. And so it's much more consistent. And we do have different types of drips. For vegetable gardens, most likely you'll see either a tape or a tube that has little holes already in it. And they're spaced out, say like a 12-inch or 18 inches apart. And you just roll that down and you connect it to the supply line, and water just drips out of that tape at that specified distance. Now, you don't have to have your plants that far apart. You can have them closer, you can have them farther apart, but that's the pattern that will lay the water down very specifically. We can also get types of drip irrigation where we can control where the water goes even more with emitters. So we use this a lot in landscaping, where you can have a drip emitters going to like a shrub or a tree or one specific plant. But we can use these in vegetable gardens. It's also very handy. You can now buy kits specifically made for, say, patio plants, outdoor planters. And so if you had like a deck or a patio with containers on it, you could actually run water to those and have it drip right in there and set it up on a timer. And so those are the specific types of, the main specific types of drip. You can even buy like little teeny tiny sprinklers in this. I've seen that's like this emitter, but it maybe sprays out water for like 2 feet. And so you don't have the one little drop of water, you have maybe like a 2-foot semicircle of water that comes out. So like I said, for the drip irrigation, we do have some other setups that we have to have, but if you buy a kit, everything that you need will come in there. And so, we hook it up to our faucet, we can add a timer. Sometimes, and always, usually we should use what's called a backflow preventer. That means that if the water gets turned off, then it won't flow back into the water system and contaminate the water system. And so that's always a good idea. Usually a filter of some sort on this drip irrigation, because those little openings are so fine that even like the tiniest little particle of gunk from the water hose, even if it's city or municipal water, there still could be little particulates in there. So there's a filter, and then that pressure regulator. And so that will put it to the right pressure for the drip irrigation. And then it connects to some sort of main supply tube. So most of the drip irrigation that we use for vegetable gardens, there will be like a main tube that is 1/2 an inch. And then you will have your tapes or tubes or drippers coming off of that. So that's what supplies it to the garden. And I'll show you next up. So we see these layouts that I snagged from a company that sells drip irrigation. I don't even know who it is. I just found this online. But we have our water source here, and this is that 1/2 inch mainline tube that comes across right there. And then the little drip lines come right off of there. And we have each line in our garden that we then use drip irrigation. Doesn't have to be in a straight line. You could like weave it back and forth between the plants there. And you can even get little controllers to put here. Let's say, okay, my tomatoes need watered today, but I don't need to water my other stuff. I can actually turn off all of these little drips and only water my tomatoes that day. So it can be really fine-tuned. There are other setups like this one. The main lines are going, it goes down through the garden and then it comes off each side. So the nice thing is, it takes a little play and practice with it. But it's basically like if you've ever played with Legos or an erector set, it's just little join pieces that you stick in the tube. You usually poke a hole in the mainline tube and stick it all together. So it's like a little building kit that you get to build your own irrigation system with. So how do you know how much water you're adding or how much you need to add? So you can, if you're using, let's say, like a sprinkler or even a soaker hose, you don't know how much water is coming out of there because it's not regulated. You can do the tuna can test, which if you go to most extension offices in this country, they will have some box full of old, hopefully clean tuna cans where they go out and test people's irrigation or show people how to test their irrigation. And basically, before you turn your sprinkler on, put a few tuna cans, at least 2, you can do more. Put those tuna cans out in the garden in different places. Run the sprinklers, run the water for 15 minutes, and then measure the depth in each can and take an average. And then you know that your hourly rate of irrigation is that depth times 4. And so that's the hour. So if you got 1/4 of an inch in 15 minutes, then you would know that it's an inch an hour. And so then you can figure out, oh, well, it didn't rain any this week, so I need an inch of irrigation. I need to run it for an hour. Or maybe I got 1/2 an inch of rain, so I need 1/2 an inch of water in the garden. And so I need to run the sprinklers for at least 1/2 an hour this week sometime. And so you can do a simple test like that. For drip irrigation, it's a little more specific. But one of the nice things is each of those drip tapes or the emitters will tell you exactly how much water comes out of that drip per hour. Most of them are like 1/2 a gallon or 1 gallon, or sometimes even up to 2 or 4 gallons per hour. And so you would figure out how much you need. So let's say, we didn't get any rain this week. We need that inch of water. And we know that inch of water is 0.6 gallons per square feet. Then we would need to run our, say, if our drip line or our drip emitters gave out 1 gallon per hour, we know that we need to run that for 2/3 of an hour. Sometime during the week, maybe in 2 or 3 shifts through the week. We can also see that that drip, we're looking at the square footage of how much comes out of that dripper. And so it doesn't just like sit right under the dripper, it spreads out. So you can observe this. It's usually by soil type, but you might see that, oh, the water from this drip emitter spreads out over, say, 2 or 3 square feet while I run it. And so then you would know that, okay, I need to multiply that time by the 2 or 3 square feet because I know that I need to fill this entire area. Or if you don't want to do that, you can just calculate the size of your garden. So if you have like a 4x8 raised bed, you know that that's 32 square feet. And so then you would do the math, 32 times 0.6, which I haven't done and I don't have the brain power to do right now. But you would know that that's how much water you need to get in that bed during the week. I did mention timers, and I thought I threw a slide in here, but I didn't. So you can get all different kinds of timers. Some that are very basic, you would go out and turn it on like manually, and you would set how long you want it to run. Like think of a kitchen timer, like, oh, I want the water to run 30 minutes. I go turn it on and it runs for 30 minutes. You can get electronic ones that are battery or solar powered that you can turn on different days or different times of days and have them run different lengths of time. Those are a little more user involved, but it's really nice because then you can sort of set it and forget it. Oh, I forgot to water the garden, or that it just does it automatically for you. The caveat with those is that if it's raining a lot, it will still water, and so you can overwater. However, now, at home, I actually use a smart timer, which is like a really, fun thing. It actually connects to the Wi-Fi at my house and connects to my phone, and it actually looks at the weather report. And it actually looks at percentages of rain. And if it rains that day or is going to rain that day, it will not water. And it actually looks at how much water is forecast for the next few days, and will base its watering on that. So it'll either water or won't, or will delay watering. Let's say if it rains today, it'll wait to water for maybe a day or two later to make sure that it's not overwatering. So you can find all kinds of different tools and tricks and techniques to use with these kinds of technologies. So just a note that in 2 weeks, June 26th, I believe is the date, our friend Kyle, who talks about diseases, will be talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly of pest control. So different types of pest control and ways to control them, what to do with integrated pest management to avoid problems, what to spray if you need to spray, those types of things. So come ready for that in 2 weeks. And then you can always reach out. You can find me on social media, email, and then we have our GROBigRed website and YouTube channel and Twitter. So find us in all different places.